At this point, I'd like to introduce Paul Tordak from Alaska Pacific University.
Thanks, Kurt. Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Alaska Forum on the Environment. Thanks to the organizers, the United People, the Kanik and the Klutna tribes for having me here today. Like Kurt said, I'm Paul Tordak. I'm the director of Alaska Pacific University's Institute of Culture and Environment, and I'll be introducing our keynote, Charles Wohlforth, in a minute. But first, a story about place and environment, and an update on APU. In 1989, I had just started working at APU as a lowly student activities coordinator. Before then, I worked teaching outdoor education, and had spent around 200 days falling in love with a beautiful place, Prince William Sound. In the end of March that year, that love was tested by Exxon oil spill. Before that, when I was 22, I had survived cancer of the mouth, and I knew what environmental toxins meant personally. Seeing this amazing place that I'd spent so much time and contaminated was devastating to me. But I kept going back and have witnessed its slow recovery. The lessons of observation, preventative action, and constant advocacy was never lost on me. Because of that experience, and the fact that some of my favorite students have been Alaska Natives, when APU's board decided to pursue becoming a tribal university serving Alaska Native people through a wide range of new programs focused on health, I was really excited. APU, then called Alaska Methodist University, was founded by Peter Golden Gould, an Aleut from Unga, to enable indigenous leadership in Alaska. This new path APU has started on reflects Gould's ideas and values. At this meeting, I'm really excited to announce the launch of 3 new programs at APU, an AA in nursing, a BS in health science, and a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Public Health, all coming this fall, 2019. I'm especially thrilled about the environmental health degree relevant to this group here. The degree will prepare students to be environmental health professionals, investigating, reporting, and addressing environmental hazards in the built and natural environment. Students will help address, in APU's hands-on learning environment, the many challenges facing rural and urban Alaska. We're also partnering with the Alaska Forum on the Environment to offer college credit for a forestry technician training program this May 1st through the 10th at APU. These new programs reflect our values of wisdom, respect, reciprocity, relevance, and responsibility as we produce world-class, hands-on, culturally responsive educational experiences in collaboration with our students, communities, and tribal partners. A question I get at the booth out in the back is, when will you become a tribal university? Are you a tribal university? Well, the easy answer is that happens when we get over 50% of our students are Alaska Native or American Indians. The complex answer is that APU is striving to better serve the Alaska Native people while not excluding anyone, and I hope lead the way to healthy Alaskans. Now on to Charles. We're honored to have Charles Wohlforth as our keynote today. Charles has an impressive resume. He's a lifelong Alaskan. He knows just about everybody, as far as I can tell. He's one smart guy. He's a Princeton alum with a magna cum laude. I didn't know that. He is a prolific writer. He's a columnist, a reporter, an author of at least 8 books, including his latest, Beyond Earth, and endless former guidebooks, when looking it up on Amazon. He's also working on a new book on Alaska, and will be selling books in the lobby during the breaks. He's also, where I first got to know him, as a skier. We were always sort of back of the pack skiers hanging out, wondering how we'd ever keep up with the Olympians, and a radio host. One last story, he, as you know, started and created a bunch of different radio programs, and one of them was called Outdoor Explorer. And a while, like last fall at some point, he interviewed me, and I realized, I thought, well, maybe this is like an interview, like I'm interviewing for a job or something. And a little while later, he says, well, would you be interested in being a new host? And I said, well, you know, what's it take to be a new host? And I didn't hear from him for a while, and all of a sudden he says, oh, thanks for being a new host. And don't worry, it's really easy. So, you know, I said, okay, I guess I'll do this with a couple other people. And what he like an Olympic skier, I realized after doing this a few times that Charles made it look really, really easy. Because it was a lot harder than when he did it with me. So I would finish by saying that can be said about a lot of Charles' life work, of observing and sharing his insights on Alaska. He makes it look easy, but he's been an incredible asset to Alaska through his columns and his work. So on that, please welcome Charles Wohlforth.
Thanks for that introduction, Paul. I don't know if I feel a little bit like, wow, how do I live up to that, I am going to talk today, and we could put my presentation up there if you don't mind. I'd rather see that than my bald spot, about something completely different than what you've been talking about. I was talking with Kurt about, what should I talk about? I've written about so many environmental subjects, and sort of the conclusion we reached was, wow, these environmental subjects are so tough. There's not a lot of fun involved. Let's get into something that's totally different. And I wrote this book called Beyond Earth, which is exploring the idea of colonizing another planet. Like, what if we just said, let's go, right? Let's get out of here and go to another planet. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. It's like, well, what would it take, and what can we predict? And what would be the pros and cons? Because what I found out in working on this book is you actually learn a lot about Earth when you start looking at other planets and why we might want to live there, right? Or might not want to live there. So the book is about space colonization. Is it possible? Where would it work? What would it look like? And I did it with Amanda Hendricks, who is a very highly placed scientist. She's worked on a lot of NASA missions. And she was down in Pasadena and then down in Colorado. And we just worked on it via Skype. And we realized we had two really contrasting perspectives, which worked really well for us. So everybody's talking about Mars these days, right? And lots of media about living on Mars. Maybe there's life on Mars. And I guess the question that I wanted to know when I'm working on this book is how much of this is real, how much is wishful thinking, and how much is just hype? And, what implication does it have to think that it would be nicer than it really is? In other words, if we think that that's a good option, that could be a negative thing for us, right? Does it change how we feel about Earth when we look at these other planets? And then we have to think about these guys right here. My laser's not working. I don't know if you've seen the movie Mars Attacks. I've seen The Martian, I've seen Mars Attacks. Mars Attacks is definitely my favorite. And I don't know if you remember the scene where they come out, the Martians have landed, and they say, they probably come in peace. It's going to be fine. And they reach out and say, oh, you come in peace. And then the Martians just blast them. And so that's kind of what we have to think about going to other planets. It might not be as easy as we expect. But there's a lot of work going on. So I don't know if you've heard, but NASA is building a huge rocket, a big enough rocket to fly people to other planets. It's called the SLS, or Space Launch System. They're also building a capsule. Presidential goal has been stated to go to the moon and to land on Mars. When that might happen, who knows? They've been working on this rocket for a really long time. NASA's actually said they didn't want to build the rocket. They'd rather buy a rocket from somebody else. But the way these things work, the congressman from the districts where they were building the rocket said, no, keep building the rocket. So that's kind of a little bit of what our space policy is like these days. A little bit too familiar in terms of how Washington works. So meanwhile, Elon Musk went out and built almost as big a rocket as that one, and it already works. And not only that, but the boosters come down and land and can be reused, which is just an amazing technical thing. And last year, he sent it up with a car and then put a dummy in the car and released the dummy into space. And that dummy is now, and the car is now 350 million miles from the Earth. And it's orbiting on a huge orbit around Earth, and it will run into either Earth or Venus in about 15 million years. So Elon Musk is clearly completely nuts. I think we all know that. Wall Street knows that. But he does some pretty amazing things, and you don't want to underestimate him. So any good PowerPoint, you have to like start at the beginning and say what you're going to cover during the talk. Where do I buy my ticket? Do I have to wear pajamas? You know, I thought that was cool when I was a kid. Now I really don't like that look, you know? And why are we wasting all this time talking about messing up the Earth when we could be messing up other planets, right? We're really kind of being pikers just messing around with this planet. Seriously, I'm not going to talk about any of these topics. I just wanted to put the slide in and let you know that I'm not taking myself too seriously. So this is Amanda. She's a really impressive person. She was one of the lead scientists on the Cassini mission, which is going to be one of the key places of the data for this talk. Cassini was this extraordinary probe that was sent to orbit around Saturn and the moons of Saturn. And she was in charge of the ultraviolet probes on that instrument. And she's working on building other instruments now. And she's what you would call a technology optimist. She just loves all this stuff. And this is me. This is me rowing my boat in Kachemak Bay. That's what I would like to be doing. I'm not getting on a rocket, right? I can barely make it coast to coast on a 737. I know I'm not going to do this. So I'm the technology pessimist. So we put this together to like say, okay, what can we come up with? You know, the biggest challenge of this is prediction, right? Predicting the future. And as Yogi Berra said, it's tough. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. It is really the hardest predictions to make. We have a really poor record of predicting technology far in the future. Ralph Damon, this is a different Damon than Matt Damon. Ralph Damon was the president of TWA in 1955, and he predicted those jet airplanes, they're never going to catch on. That's not going to happen. He just said, like, who's ever going to want to do that? And this is like 3 years before the 707 was launched. And so instead, they held a contest asking passengers on their planes, what would aviation be like in 30 years? And the guesses came back. There'd be rocket-propelled hotels. There'd be flying taxis. There'd be helicopter house trailers. If you imagine like a trailer like could fly or something, it doesn't make much sense to me. There'd be no aviation because the world would be only monkeys. Or we wouldn't need airplanes because we'd live on other planets without gravity and we'd be able to fly without them. So how do we avoid making those kinds of mistakes in making our predictions? Well, we've taken the assumption that human nature is going to stay the same. We know how people make decisions. They'll probably still make them the same way. That means that if you're going to have a safe space colony, there'll have to be some reason to do it. You're not just going to do it for laughs. Just like we don't build things or do we always have some kind of reason to do it. Probably it's going to be something we want that's in space or something we're trying to get away from on Earth, right? Pretty much those would be the main reasons we do it. And the environment here on Earth and the environment out there is going to be a key factor because it always is. So let me read you a little bit about the winner of that contest that they made. They put all these guesses in a vault, and 30 years later, they opened the vault. It was in Kansas City, 1985, and they sorted out the predictions, and they gave the finalists to 3 judges, including Pete Conrad, who was one of the astronauts who went to the moon. And so this is the before the jet age. The contest winner described the state of aviation in the 1980s, and she had it exactly right. Commercial aircraft, the winner wrote, will have ranges about 5,000 miles, will cruise about 700 miles per hour. They'll be powered by bypass jets, since atomic energy probably will not be available to commercial aviation in 1985. Passenger ships will carry about 300 people on long trips, and cargo ships will haul about 200,000 pounds payload. The winner was Helen L. Thomas. They found her living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she'd been living previously. She was 80 years old. She'd retired from editing publications at MIT. They showed up with the check, and she wouldn't believe it. She had no memory of entering the contest, and she didn't know what they were talking about. But she got $50,000. So what did she have that the head of TWA didn't have when they looked into the future? Well, she understood the technology that already existed would probably evolve, right? 1985 was also the year telephone industry was deregulated. Telephones were basically had been the same for 100 years up to that point. And in fact, when they wrote about Helen Thomas, the New York Times in 1985 said, wow, we should have her predict what telephones are going to be like in 2015. Well, it's really hard to believe she would have guessed that one, right? So it's not always evolution. Sometimes things change really radically. So where do we put the space travel on that? Like airplanes sort of evolved, phones went out through this massive change. Space travel, it's kind of evolved, really. We really haven't seen that kind of like huge shift that would make things possible that we couldn't imagine before. 58 years, 60 years ago, Sputnik circled the Earth. Rockets are better, but they look a lot the same, you know. So the question is, what will be that big jump? Well, people have been optimistically projecting the big jump for a long time. And these are images that were created in the 1970s by NASA, real images. They thought that 10,000 people would be living in Earth orbit by now. But we now know, like, why would that happen? Why would we spend all the money to do that? Whatever is going to happen is going to be driven by economics. People will go to space, but they have a good reason. And that gives us some solid basis to predict the future. So in the book, we alternated sections talking about imagining and then sort of giving the facts and looking at the factors that we would choose. So what are the considerations for choosing another planet? These are the main ones. And these are the ones that are perfect for us here on Earth, right? We have a lot of good information about the other planets because NASA has done a fantastic job of studying them with robotic probes. And so we can say like almost everything there is to say about each of these factors in figuring out where we want to live. Now, the most important one, I'm sorry that the image is a little bit fuzzy there, but the most important one is the atmosphere and the magnetosphere. The magnetosphere is the magnetic field that is around the planet, and it shields us from radiation from the sun. The atmosphere also shields us from radiation from the sun. That's really the most amazing quality of the Earth. So this is our beautiful planet, and it really is a beautiful planet. We evolved on this planet. Everything about us biologically is perfectly tuned to live on this planet. We can live anywhere on it, right? It's got a magnetic field that's really strong. It's shielding the atmosphere from radiation. And then radiation has a lot of water, and that's shielding us from radiation as well. So the two are working together. The magnetic field is protecting the atmosphere is protecting the Earth. Mars, on the other hand, the center of, the reason we have this magnetic field is because the center of the Earth is liquid iron. On Mars, it cooled down. Magnetic field went away. Radiation stripped away the atmosphere. So you're standing on the surface of Mars, you've got a problem with the radiation. Here we don't. So think about the Earth. It's this amazing system of all these qualities that allow us to have a biosphere, allow us to live here and have it be our life support system. So it's hard to beat, but let's look at the options. So starting near the sun, the Mercury is not very promising. No atmosphere, weak magnetosphere. It's so close to the sun that it has a weird orbit, so you have 3 days every 2 years. Temperatures are incredibly hot or incredibly cold. Venus has a very, very thick atmosphere, which unfortunately is extremely poisonous. The surface pressure is 92 times our atmosphere, so it's sort of like being on the bottom of the ocean in terms of pressure. And it's incredibly hot because of the greenhouse effect, actually, the carbon dioxide. Now, there has been some concepts of how we could live on Venus. If you were at the right level of that atmosphere, the pressure and temperature would be right. But then you would be living in a dirigible. As we were looking like where would we want to live, we thought like, okay, floating around it's not going to work, right? I mean, where are you going to get your resources? And what's the point, right? But it's kind of cool, sort of like sky cities. So the moon, we know tons about the moon. We've been to the moon, and it's the only place that we really know how to get to at the moment. No atmosphere, no magnetosphere, so tons of radiation coming in. Temperatures are very hot and cold, and the landscape is just, what you see is what you get. It's a great place to visit, interesting place to visit. You kind of have to live underground if you're there. With like good science that we can do there. And you could create some kind of long-term habitat. This is something the European Space Agency came up with. But again, it's pretty unlikely that people would actually go and live there. All right, so now Mars is the star of the show. So much science going on, and so many dreams and hopes of going there. And it is a good place to go and study. It has moderate gravity, about 40% of Earth's gravity. Temperatures are on the cold side, but survivable, as we know from Alaska. It's mostly like a desert, though, and there's very thin atmosphere, so there's no magnetosphere, so there's no protection from radiation. So essentially, if you live on Mars, you're going to be living underground or in some kind of shielded habitat. This one in the lower part is made of ice. So if you have a couple of meters of ice, that would shield you. Again, living underground doesn't really make much sense to us. Like, why would you do it long term? You could go and visit, but if there's an environmental problem on Earth, if you want to say, like, we're getting away from something, you could live underground here, right? Nobody lives underground here. We don't want to live underground. So we really need to find a place where we can actually live in a way that has some biological meaning for us as human beings. So that takes us to the outer solar system. So Jupiter is our first stop. It's a challenging spot. It's made of gas. It has intense radiation. Really hard to see how you could live there. It has a bunch of moons. Io is the most volcanically active body in the solar system, so not such a good place to live. Europa has a subsurface ocean, which is very interesting, but maybe not where we would live. It's just a ball of ice with water inside it, apparently. Ganymede and Callisto have also subsurface oceans, but they're really deep under the ice. So talking about putting people there, it doesn't seem super promising. Go out to Saturn and Saturn satellites. A lot of choices. Saturn has 62 moons. Tethys, Enceladus. I had to have Amanda write out pronunciation keys for all these weird moon names. I would tend to get them wrong. Really interesting to study. Then there's a bunch of little ones that are primarily just balls of ice, pretty small, smaller than our moon. Hard to see why we would go and live on a ball of ice so far from the Earth. Then there's this one was called Mimas. It has its own problem. Don't know what that guy's doing out there, but I think we should stay away from it. There's this one little speck out there, which actually is pretty promising. It's called Titan. It's by far the best place in the solar system to live other than the Earth. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that and explain why we think Titan is our best backup option. But first, I've said a bunch of times, why would we go? What's the point? Well, there's a good counter-argument to that, which is we're always going places, right? We started out in Africa, and we just go and we go and we go. There's something human about going to new places. And we spent a lot of time working in the book looking at past colonies and past movements to new places, and including Europeans coming to America. And why did they do it? They had to have financial backing. They weren't just doing it for fun. Of course, there's one really big difference. There were already people there, right? I mean, we're talking about going to a hopefully, presumably, a totally uninhabited planet. A bit different from going and stealing somebody else's continent. This was the lost colony of Roanoke Island was a really important one for us to study. This happened during the reign of Elizabeth I. Colony was planted, lots of money, lots of backing, died out, everybody died, nobody knows what happened to them. Why? Well, when it was time to be resupplied, the Spanish Armada attacked England, and the Queen was not going to send ships to resupply some colony way out in America. So we got to think about that too, right? If you're going to send a colony to another planet, heavens knows what could be happening on Earth. If we're in the middle of a world war, are we going to send a rocket out to resupply them? Maybe not, right? So it needs to, whatever it is, it's going to have to be self-sufficient. It's going to have to be able to get all its own resources, produce its own food, energy, oxygen, anything it needs. So, you know, we don't think of indigenous people as colonists, but of course they were. And if you think about the Polynesians sailing out into the Pacific, I mean, what they did in a way was way more daring than what we're doing as you know, spacefarers. They were sailing out in the middle of the ocean, and they didn't even know if anything was there. We could at least look up and see where we're going, right? We actually know a lot about where we're going. And so you have to, like, some degree say, like, why did they take that kind of risk? There's some pretty hard-ass indigenous people who colonized our little corner of the world as well. They were presumably coming from the direction of Siberia, maybe 10,000 years ago. You know, there's a lot of discussion about how it happened. But to do it, they had to survive really cold weather, figure out how to survive in a hostile environment, just as we would have to do if we were going to space. And that meant they had to create some amazing technology for their time, including make boats and warm clothing that would get them there safely. And don't underestimate the technology that they did create. Building a shelter for them was just as hard as building a space habitat would be for us. If you can imagine digging your home out of frozen ground with stone tools, you got to catch a whale so that you can make the rafters to go on top to put on the sod. Okay, these are not difficult tasks. These homes were more expensive than any home we live in now, right? If you think about the human cost of building these homes. And what did the technology do? It was warm, you know, we know how cold it is in the Arctic. It was warm enough in these places with a steel oil lamp that you didn't wear clothes indoors. I mean, the insulation was that good. So that's amazing technology, and it worked. So technology is the key to colonization. So why did they do it? Well, I'm sure a lot of people know Richard. They were motivated by environmental change. You know, their overcrowding and conflict probably drove them to North America from Asia. And then the Inupiaq culture developed around 1,000 years ago because of a climate change, because of a change in the availability of open water to catch a whale. You needed to concentrate in certain areas, built that culture, and it spread all the way to Greenland. And so we know that for our Alaskans, climate change has driven these cultural changes and these migrations. You know, coming back to sort of like more contemporary history, the American West, the draw was minerals and open space for agriculture, but for the people who are going, it was largely there in the East, and they didn't have enough space, and they didn't have enough opportunity. So they went to find a better life. You know, the pioneers who came out to these wilderness places kind of scratched around, but they really didn't accomplish that much until they had big, major financial backing. And this is kind of sort of the difference from the old log cache to the modern mining. This is said to be one of the biggest holes in the world. It's a diamond mine that's abandoned in Yakutia. And I mean, the reason I put it up there is just you need big-time investment to go after big-time resources. You know, in the American West, the way it worked was the government gave these huge land grants so that the railroads could be built. The westward movement, the colonization of pioneers, was really a government-funded project in a lot of ways. And that really has always been the case because individuals rarely have the kind of resource it takes to truly colonize a new area. We have our own Alaskan story on that too, the construction of the Alaska Railroad. I wrote a book about Anchorage history, and I found this fact that totally blew my mind. The construction of the Alaska Railroad in total, about $72 million. At that time, the entire federal budget for everything was $730 million. So they spent basically 10% of all the money for the entire country building this crazy railroad. Just as a point of reference, that's 20 times what we're spending on NASA right now. So pretty big commitment, right? And you wouldn't expect better results than we're getting now for the amount of money we're spending. And generally, the railroad has never really made money, but it developed the colony. And so, you know, the lesson is that colonies need a reason to exist environmentally or economically. They need big government investment that you probably can't expect to get back. And they ultimately have to be able to support themselves without help from home. So where would we be able to do that? Well, I kind of discouraged you with the earlier review of planets, right? But now I'm going to give you one where you could actually do those things. Titan is a very unusual and interesting place. It has a thick atmosphere. It's mostly nitrogen, just like our atmosphere, with some methane. The surface pressure is about 1.5 times what it is here, so about 50% more pressure from the atmosphere. Doesn't have its own magnetosphere, but it's within Saturn's magnetosphere, so that protects it. What really sets it apart is its location. So it doesn't have this radiation problem. If you're on the surface of Titan, you're not worried about radiation. And all these facts are going to come from the Cassini mission that my co-author Amanda worked on. So I look at it, boy, it looks more like the Earth than the other planets does, doesn't it? There's these bright and dark regions caused by clouds and caused by land masses. Here's a map created by Cassini, and you can see that quality that it has. And there's, right in the middle, there's a little red spot, and that's where the Cassini probe carried a smaller probe, and it dropped it down to the surface to see what it would actually look like on the surface of Titan. And here's an image that shows that probe coming down and what it looked like as it made its descent. Make sure I'm on time here. And measure the conditions. And here's a picture that it took looking out the window on the surface of Titan. And what you see is it looks like a little bit like a riverbed with these sort of rock-like objects. Those are chunks of ice, because Titan is a really interesting place. What we think of as rock on our planet is water on Titan. It's it's mostly water, but it's so cold, at 290 degrees below zero, that the water's like ice. So don't let that drive you off, right? We're going to deal with that cold issue. It also has a lot of Earth-like features. So it has these dunes, and these are photos of dunes on Earth and also dunes on Titan. But instead of being made of sand, the dunes on Titan are made of hydrocarbons. Has clouds and rain and swamps and lakes, not water, hydrocarbons. So this is a planet where you get these clouds that form of these hydrocarbons, and they come down through rain and form lakes. And here's a radar image that shows you those lakes and seas. And they've been named, the scientists always have some weird way of naming things. They named the lakes after Earth lakes, and they named the seas after mythological monsters. So the Kraken mare is the sea, and then some of these Cayuga lacus is named after a lake on Earth. And here's the Ligaea mare. Looks an awful lot like a water body on Earth, doesn't it? It's liquid methane, not water. The shore is water. The shore is frozen water. Here's another view. Amazingly Earth-like in the way it looks. So, when will we get there? How do we get to Titan? Well, we've been talking about getting to Mars for quite a while. And there have been all these predictions. Elon Musk is going to do it for us, and President Obama, now President Trump has also announced going to Mars. Currently, we're going to be there in 2033, supposedly. Went back and found some old articles. In 1989, we were going to be there by 2011. And then this was a funny one. 1969, President Nixon said, we got to slow down on this Mars thing. We can't expect to get there right away. So the discussion has been going on literally for my entire lifetime almost. Like, why is it taking so long? Well, I've got some of the bad news for you here. This very, very busy thing is NASA's most recent analysis of risks of spaceflight for a long-term mission, like going up to Mars or going around Mars. And it's across the top are years, and then down the side are all the health risks that make spaceflight too dangerous. That's a lot of health risks that are listed there. And wherever it's red is keyed as high probability, high consequence. And then yellow is moderate probability, moderate consequence. A lot of problems that are not going to be solved before 2030. And these are problems that are pretty big problems. One of them is the impact of space radiation on the brain. And this is something that people are kind of surprised to hear about, but this space radiation, this cosmic ray radiation, actually damages brain cells. It comes through your body, and really we don't know of any way to shield it. Here's a breakdown of what that one looks like. In terms of 1 year of space travel, moderate probability, moderate consequence of brain damage of the astronauts. In other words, they wouldn't be able to function well enough to drive the spacecraft because the radiation would have damaged their brains. That's leaving aside the cancer, that's leaving aside all the other problems that are on that list. Here's the deal, guys. We were not designed to go to space. We were designed for this planet we're on right here. And we go to space and nothing works. We have to do a lot of stuff just to stay healthy. And for over a year, we don't know how to do it. And it's going to take a year to get to Mars and back and do anything. It's going to take 2 or 3 years at least. So why is this radiation issue such a big deal? These galactic cosmic rays, they call them rays, but actually what they are is nuclei of atoms that have been sent out from supernova. They're traveling at the speed of light. They're as big as an iron nucleus, just shooting through, and they're really hard to stop. It takes 2 meters of water, solid water, will stop 50%. Now, the reason we're safe here on the surface of this planet is there's so much water above us in the air. And this is what it looks like as they hit the, this is sort of an artist's conception of what it looks like as these things are hitting the Earth. And so if you can imagine a spacecraft that's blanketed by 2 meters of water, just for frame of reference, a meter cube of water weighs a ton. That's hard to imagine, right? Especially a habitat that's big enough for people. Wow, we're going to need a really big rocket. So the question is that a total showstopper? Well, Amanda and I debated this a long time, and we decided it's certainly a showstopper right now, but can we say that it will never be possible? We think that if you could build a fast enough spacecraft, you could get through the danger zone quickly enough, then on the other end you could find shelter. And the speed at which this kind of development is happening is just so mind-blowing that there is some reason to believe it. And we were able to kind of sneak into the SpaceX factory where they're building these rockets and spend a day talking to one of the engineers there. And I was so blown away by the energy and what's happening there, talking to this young woman who was a recent graduate and was in charge of the second stage of the rocket and had launched more than a dozen rockets. She was younger than my kid. She was 28 years old. And just getting her energy, you said, okay, this could actually happen. Let me read you a little bit about that from the book. A bright room the size of a sports arena bubbled with activity as workers for SpaceX, mostly young people, casually dressed, worked on rockets the size of airliners in various stages of assembly. Against one wall, a set of legs like airplane wings were ready for a rocket's first stage that would be able to stand upright on Earth after delivering its payload to space. From the ceiling hung a capsule prototype for carrying a team of astronauts to orbit. Seamstresses were sewing spacesuits that looked like movie costumes. It all reminded us of a Tintin comic book, the vision of a space center any of us would invent in our imaginations if we could make it so. Our guide, Jamie Hoffman, said, rule number 1 is functionality. Rule number 2, which is almost as important, is cool factor. We said Jamie's job must be really cool, and she said, oh my God. But we didn't yet realize how cool, because we thought Jamie's job was our tour guide. Then 25, she had come to SpaceX straight from school. She was with tour guide enthusiasm. In fact, Jamie was in charge of the second stage of the rocket, the portion that lifts the payload to space. She explained while she showed us one. Everything that happens to this stage, I have to decide, she said. This was a conversation that convinced us that space colonization is real and is coming sooner than most people think. Elon Musk's SpaceX has found the key. It's not a technological key, although they are building amazing new technology too. It's the spirit of innovation, the fun that goes with invention, and the worldview of youth. Everyone at SpaceX seems to be Jamie's age, and no one has told them they can't invent new rockets fast, reliably, cheaply, and get them to space right now. So what kind of rocket are we going to need? This is another interesting guy we met. His name is Sonny White. He actually works for NASA. He's in charge of a lab. And he is trying to develop a warp drive. And he's working on a bunch of really advanced ideas. All sounds a little crazy. But until you realize that, okay, he actually works there. This is his job. You think, okay. And then you ask him, like, how does it work? And he gives you stuff like this. I'm not going to try to explain this to you, but the basic idea is that you collect this exotic matter in a ring. It would create a bubble of space-time, and then space itself would stretch. So while you're traveling, you're traveling at a normal speed, but space has changed its shape, and so you can leap from one spot in space to another. And a lot of scientists say, well, that's impossible. But they're having a discussion. So that's the kind of technology leap we're going to need to get to Titan, because Titan is a really, really long way from here. But what would it be like if we get there? Now we can do a little imagination. First of all, it helps you think about like how interesting it is that we live on a planet of rock and that water is sort of the thing that we swim around in. On Titan, the planet is made of water, which is solid, and then these hydrocarbons are what makes the liquid and the rain and the clouds. How does that come about? Well, it comes about because of its position in the solar system and the photons that hit this kind of gunk that's up in the atmosphere. It transforms sort of the basic elements into hydrocarbons. Very different process than we think of as fossil fuels. There's no dinosaurs up there creating the hydrocarbons. They're created directly by chemistry of ultraviolet light in the atmosphere of the planet. And there you can see, that's an actual image of the atmosphere of Titan as you're looking through it, this haze that's in the atmosphere. So what happens is that haze, these molecules get larger and larger. When they get large enough, they turn into this methane rain, which falls down on the planet. It's cold enough that it stays condensed and creates the seas. And so for those of you in the oil industry, I know you're salivating now. This is a planet that's nothing but hydrocarbons? Could we burn that? Well, yes, you could burn it, right? So you would think, like, what if you light a match on Titan, does the whole planet explode? No. One little problem, there's no oxygen. So your match would not light. But there's all that water. And what is water made of? Hydrogen and oxygen. So this is sort of a cross-section of how the scientists believe that ice is solid on the surface, and then it's sort of slushy underneath. And then there's probably a rock core. We have an iron core on our planet. There, the core is the rock. So what you'd have to do is use some of that ice. Here's a cutaway. So the lake on top is the methane, and then the ice is underneath. The ice is what is made of what's making the shores of the lake. And so down below, you've got these. This is a very complicated slide, and if Amanda was here, she could explain it to you. But essentially, what you've got is different kinds of ice with different kinds of constituent parts. But the beauty of it is we know how to take water and turn it into oxygen and hydrogen. This is an actual electrolysis machine. You just put electricity through the water, it breaks the oxygen and hydrogen. You can then use the oxygen to burn the hydrocarbons, and you'd have essentially a limitless supply of energy on Titan. Just one of those lakes contains more methane than all the natural gas on Earth. So that's sort of the sciencey part. What about the fun part? Well, I told you that the atmosphere there is thicker than the Earth's, and it's also quite cold. The impact of that is it's really easy to fly on Titan. All kinds of ideas about little planes you can make, but in fact, you wouldn't need a plane. You could just put wings on your arms and fly, and you would be able to fly. How cool is that, right? Now, granted, you'd probably want some kind of thruster, because if you've ever tried to run in a swimming pool, it can be a little frustrating, right? All that water, I call it water, but all that liquid methane, you could build a submarine. And NASA's actually designed a submarine, And a group of scientists has proposed sending a spacecraft to Titan, taking the submarine out of the spacecraft, sending it underneath those lakes and seeing what's down there. Because there's some ideas that there could be a methane-based form of life swimming around down there. And there's even evidence that there's some kind of respiration happening that's using this energy that's there in that methane. So this is sort of a concept of what that sub could look like. Or let's have a regatta, right? I mean, any kind of boat. Any vehicle that works on Earth will work on Titan. It'll have to be adjusted a little bit. Now, as I said, it's quite cold, but you've got all this hydrocarbons. You can make all the plastic you possibly want. You could have a plastic city. And go outdoors, you wouldn't need a spacesuit because there's no radiation, right? You just need to have really warm clothing and an oxygen mask. So it's not like this deal of like walking around in a spacesuit, and if you get one hole, you decompress and you die. So I'm going to conclude now, but I just want to read you a passage from the book that sort of sums up some of our thoughts about this journey that we took into the solar system. The trends of environmental and political conditions on Earth are as important part of a scenario for space colonization as the technology story, and an important part of understanding ourselves. Along with learning how our bodies respond to space, we need to predict how our societies will respond to a deteriorating environment, increasing political and religious conflict, and widening wealth disparities. The inspiring and discouraging qualities that make people such interesting animals are already mixing to create the movement towards space. Billionaires are building spaceships to go farther than any man or woman has gone before. At the same time, they make money selling tickets for joyrides beyond the atmosphere. We've met brilliant young engineers at commercial space companies who are driving down the cost of access to space. They're putting in long hours to make spaceflight a part of everyday life and thinking several steps beyond. They don't work so hard just for a paycheck. These young aerospace workers speak the language of Star Trek, attacking huge technical challenges with the dexterity and attitude of hackers. They're unfamiliar with failure and utterly sure they're on their way to space. Spending time with these people, it's not hard to imagine a day when a huge spaceship will prepare for departure from the end of a long retractable corridor connected to a commercial space station orbiting the Earth. The scenario may sound like science fiction, but doesn't the future often sound like science fiction until it suddenly arrives? So that's what I have for you today. I have some books out in the lobby, and I'm really looking forward to talking to folks who have ideas or questions. I'm going to make a beeline out of here so I can get to the books. Otherwise, I'll be trapped here talking to you. So come out and talk with me in the lobby. And I just also want to say that my work on this book made me realize that the work that you are doing and that we do when we talk about the environment is so important. Because as you look at the prospects for going to other planets, you realize that if anyone ever goes, it's going to be a very small subsection of the people and the creatures on this planet. It's really just exploration. It's really just imagining something that's so far in the future that probably no one in this room will be alive when it happens, when people actually go to live there. Just getting 3 astronauts to Mars is estimated to cost $1 trillion, right? There's nothing about any of this that is cheaper than taking care of this planet. This planet is a treasure. It's completely unique. And anybody who tells you, well, we can mess it up and fix it later, or we can go to plan B, is just telling you a story. So the work you're doing is more important than the work these scientists and astronauts are doing. The work you're doing to protect this planet is the most important work you could be doing. Thank you.